What would you do if in the dead of night, right outside your window, you heard 3 chilling knocks? And by morning, every chicken was gone, leaving behind only the sharp, musky scent of musk in the air. The truth few people know is this: sometimes the creature in the woods isn't a wild beast at all. It can be the perfect cover for a far more calculated crime. I've spoken to witnesses and walked the very grounds of the Oregon forest where giant footprints aren't just a campfire story. In the next few minutes, you'll learn how to tell the difference between a knock that warns you and one that greets you, how to spot when someone is fabricating a monster story, and why strange markings carved into tree bark could actually save your life in the wilderness. Take Jess Carter, 34. She once thought there was only one creature watching them, until she discovered a curious young one mimicking human voices and stumbled upon steel traps, tranquilizers, and infrasound machines hidden beneath an old cabin. That discovery changed everything. This information is almost never shared publicly. And if you skip it, you might keep believing a lie that's been alive for decades. I remember the morning, by the way. The air stung, not just cold, needle cold. My breath hung pale and brittle as glass over the porch rail, and the fog lay heavy across the pasture like a damp wool blanket that nobody asked for. Every fence staple wore a bead of water. Every cedar post had a silver sheen. Somewhere to the west, a coyote finished a thought and let the sound fall off a cliff. I told myself it was just another dawn on our place in Oregon, quiet as a pew and just as sacred. I told myself a lot of things that ended at the chicken coop. The grass bent under my boots, wet enough to soak my socks through if I let it. Dew clung to my jeans and the cuffs got dark and heavy. My coffee steamed up into my face and smelled like earth and burnt sugar, and then the coop came into view. The old cedar door standing just wrong. Tilted, strained at the top hinge. I slowed without deciding to slow. Something in the fog around the coop had density, like the air got thicker from one fence post to the next. The ground sagged a bit where we always stepped, and even the mud felt unfamiliar, as if a stranger had walked it into a different shape overnight. The door was open, but not open the way wind makes a door go. The upper hinge was bent, but not the kind of bend you get from weight over time. It was a single decision, executed with force. The lower hinge had a twist in it that made my stomach roll. The little brass padlock I used out of habit lay a few inches away, half sunk in mud, still closed. I picked it up. The lock felt warm from my hand and out of place in the morning, like jewelry at a funeral. I listened. Not even a flutter. No uneasy peep building to 1,000. Just an empty, soft hum the fog was making all by itself. I put my hand on the cedar plank and the wood felt damp and strangely warm, as if it had trapped breath. Then the smell hit, sour and musky with a rank sweetness underneath, a little like wet dog and skunk and resin all stuck together and left to cure. It wasn't just strong, it got in my mouth. It crawled up the back of my nose and settled behind my eyes. I gagged and tasted metal and the taste of my own fear. I stepped inside the doorway and waited for my eyes to adjust, though there wasn't much to adjust to. No feathers, not a single one stuck to the wire. No blood, not even a smear. The straw lay pressed flat where bodies should have been, molded in 40 little bowls of absence. I counted without meaning to count. 5 roosts, 8 birds per run. The math landed hard and stupid. 40 gone, and the straw didn't look torn up, and nothing smelled like fox or weasel or anything I knew. The feed bin lid was still set on the nail the way I always left it, like someone had looked at my habits and decided to respect them. Outside the doorframe, the mud showed me what my mind already refused. The impressions weren't prints the way a book would show you prints. They were deep, fat ovals torn at the edges where weight had rolled through. 2 inches down. Easy. Deeper than my hand when I pressed it flat. The shape wasn't right for a boot, no tread, no heel edge. Just a wide, living weight that had stood and adjusted, stood and shifted, and then moved on. The edges held the shape of movement, and in each depression a puddle was slowly collecting itself around a single blade of grass, quivering. I backed away without turning. The fog moved with me like it had been listening. The wind came through the firs in a thin thread, high enough to sing glass, and it made the guy wires on the corner posts vibrate just under hearing. The sound made the skin on my forearms pull tight. I didn't drop the lock until I reached the gate, and when the cheap little thing hit the mud, it made a sound that didn't carry at all, like the fog swallowed it on purpose. Daryl came up fast from the barn, breath showing, wool cap pulled low. He had hay on his jacket, and he tried to set his face in that "yes, I see" and "yes, we'll sort it" way he uses when a calf breaches or a water line breaks under the frost. He reached for the hinge and ran a thumb along the twist. His mouth thinned. He didn't say it, but I could hear it in his breath. "This isn't a raccoon, Jess. This isn't even a bear." He squatted and pressed his palm into one of the depressions and then set his hand beside it like he was measuring a child's growth on a door frame. His eyes flicked up to mine and then away, because naming a thing before you need to has a cost, and he knew it. Bob's old Ford eased up the lane like a thought that took its time. He killed the engine, and the silence grew back in immediately, a living thing that reclaimed space. He swung through the gate without asking, a hand on the top wire like we all do, and his boots stuck in places they never stuck before. He didn't come all the way to the door. He stopped where the ground started telling the story and rubbed his jaw under a day's gray stubble. "Cattle been steering clear of the tree line these last couple nights," he said, voice just above the fog. "Won't graze the far pasture. Even the mule won't stand with his butt to the woods. Acts like it hears something I can't." He looked at the hinge, then at Daryl, then at me, and I could tell he was measuring what he thought we could carry before breakfast. I wanted to scrub that smell off the door, off my hands, off the inside of my head. I wanted feathers, I wanted blood. I wanted something that fit a shape I kept in a drawer for emergencies. I didn't get it. What I got was the weird calm that comes when terror has nothing to grab onto. So it sits down for a second and lets you breathe. I set the door back against the post like that would help. I collected the scattered screws like maybe I could screw the morning back together. I told myself to focus on the practical. Call Hale after breakfast, set a trail cam, check the generator fuel, make a list. Making a list is a kind of prayer out here. If you can name the steps, maybe the steps will hold. We walked back up toward the house together, 3 figures in a gray field, and the fog parted around us like an old curtain that didn't remember how to close. Daryl kept his hands open and loose at his sides. Bob drifted to the fence line, eyes moving along the trees as if a shape might resolve if he stared hard enough, as if patience had a scent. I kept feeling the absence behind us. 40 small lives that had warmed the coop with their breath and their gossip every morning since spring. And now the air behind us had no sound except the hush of wet needles sliding against one another high in the firs. Even the ravens were careful. They sat hunched on the radio tower and let the day decide who it wanted to be. On the porch, the boards creaked at the same places they always creaked, but my mind counted them like new creaks, as if the house had grown old overnight. I scraped my boots on the iron grate, but the mud clung, stubborn, and the smell lifted again. Faint, but there. A shadow of what saturated the coop door. I took another breath to test it and coughed, surprised at my own body, surprised that breath could refuse me in my own space. I reached for the handle, wanting coffee I hadn't already tasted, wanting the pan to heat and the sound of eggs hitting butter to fill the kitchen like a normal morning. Daryl touched the small of my back the way you guide someone through a crowd. Bob took off his hat and stood by the rail, not coming in, not leaving either. The kitchen had the faint chill of a room left alone too long, even though we'd been up before dawn. I set the kettle and watched a drop of water shiver on the spout. The clock over the sink ticked with a small throb that matched the pulse in my neck. Habit took over. Cups, kettle, sugar nobody uses, the spoon that never goes missing. I told myself that whatever had walked those 2 inches into our ground did not get to have this part of my morning. I told myself that courage sometimes looks like half a grapefruit and a knife and a silent agreement to sit at the same table and pretend the world isn't moving. I turned to close the door, hand on the jamb, and that's when I saw it. Not straight on, not framed by anything that would admit to framing. In the glass of the back window, a smear the color of old amber caught the light from the pale sky and held it like a faint, sickly flame. 5 wide arcs, imperfect, sloping in a way that human hands don't quite slope, as if something had touched its palm and fingers to the glass with weight, then pulled away slow, leaving a resin shine and a drag of grit. The lines had texture, tiny ridges where the pad must have lifted. In a few places, hair caught the light, dark and short and curved. My reflection sat inside the handprint, small and warped, swallowed by it. I didn't call out. My body knew the equation before my mind did. Call out and make it real. Call out and make it panic. I stepped closer without deciding to. Saw the way the smear thinned at the top where finger became air. Saw the faint map my breath made around it. Little clouds that haloed the stain and then broke. I touched the glass beside it and felt a cold that had a memory in it. The surface gave the tiniest squeak under my fingertip. I could smell it again. Fainter now. Diluted by house air and coffee steam, but there. The sour musk, the rank sweetness, the resin note like the forest had leaned its face against our home and considered us, then left. Behind me, Daryl stopped moving. The quiet changed. Bob's boots thumped once on the porch and then went still. I could feel the weight of their attention falling onto the same 5 arcs I was staring at, and the house seemed to draw in a breath and hold it, like it too had decided not to be the first to speak. Far off, the foghorn note of the wind in the radio tower wires drifted down again and settled into the window glass, and the print didn't fade. It held, perfect and wrong, claiming space in our morning. The kettle clicked off. A bird somewhere found its courage and called, tentative, then corrected itself and went quiet. I kept my hand on the doorframe, not sure whether I was holding myself up or holding the house in place. Something in me leaned toward the glass the way you lean toward a confession you're not ready to hear. Something else in me leaned away, already drawing a line through the pasture in my mind, already hammering posts in a map I didn't know I knew how to draw. Out past the trees, the fog began to lift in torn strips, the way a curtain frays at the edge when it's been handled too much, and the shape of the day took on a little more bone. I could imagine the coupe door exactly where it was, the hinge twisted into a question mark, the lock in the mud, the depressions filling slowly with light. I could imagine the path between that door and this window. I could imagine weight. I could imagine breath. I could imagine a gaze that measured our little house not as a thing to enter, but as a thing to stand beside and consider. And then I lowered my hand, and the glass gave back my face, smaller now, and the print remained, steady as a thought you can't ignore, waiting for whatever would come next. Rain came in bands after dark, thick as a beaded curtain you had to shoulder through just to cross the porch. The tin roof flattened it into a dull roar, a low ocean that lived above our heads. Every now and then thunder set its own table, a clean strike, a belly-deep roll, then the long tail that made the window panes hum. I kept telling myself that storms have a language, and I knew it. But somewhere inside all that water and electricity, something else was talking. It wasn't a coyote chain or an elk bugle pulled out of season. It wasn't wind in a culvert. It rose under the thunder and braided into it, a raw cross between a growl and a howl, and it had beats, a pulse, 3 even measures, a pause, 2 shorter, another pause, then 1 long note that hung like a held breath. It felt less like a cry and more like counting. The sound moved left to right across the timber as if a mouth was pacing the line of firs and deciding what numbers meant. The power browned for a second and the living room went dim, light pulling back into the filaments like turtles into shells. I put my hand on the lamp and waited it out, counting with the storm without admitting it. Daryl flicked his eyes to the window, to the little digital clock on the stove, to the breaker panel in his head that he knows by heart. He shrugged into his jacket, the one with the tear on the shoulder from the fence last year, and said he'd take a look at the barn. I went with him because staying inside felt like letting the storm think it owned us. The barn had that warm animal smell even after most of the cows bedded down in the lower pasture. Alfalfa and rope and old leather. Dust gone to paste on every beam and ladder rung. The big sliding door rattled against its track in a way that used to comfort me and tonight sounded like a throat clearing. We swung the light up and there, right where the second loft beam crosses the back wall, 4 clean gouges raked through damp wood high. Higher than I could reach even on tiptoe. 7 feet, easy, measured against the nail heads we'd set at 6 the day we built the hay shelves. The marks weren't wild. They were parallel, deliberate, a seam ripper laid against the barn's hide. Below, a 50-pound bale sat turned 90 degrees, twine intact. Edges still sharp like a cake no one's cut yet. You don't move a bale like that by accident. You don't rotate it clean unless you know exactly what you're holding. Daryl stood over it with his hands hooked in his pockets, not touching, as if the bale might bruise. He looked up at the gouges and then down at the floor again. I knew his inventory. Bear? Doesn't climb like that. Cat? Leaves a different signature. Man? No. Not this tall, not this careful, not this intent on making lines. The next thunder cracked so close the barn swallowed it and sent it back through the rafters like a deep bell. Then that other sound came again, richer for the wood around us, and my chest answered without permission. 3 counts, pause, 2, pause, 1 long. It lifted the tiny hairs along my forearms and made my molars ache. I stepped out to the covered walkway and found the hammer we use for gates. I don't know why I picked it up. I only knew I wanted something simple to say into the night. I set the head against the porch rail and tapped 3 even knocks. Not hard, not aggressive. 3 plain notes of wood on wood, so small under the rain I half believed they wouldn't carry. The forest answered from somewhere between the first stand of firs and the ravine. 3 knocks back, deeper. The same spacing, the same patience. The sound rode the water and came through the noise like a coin flashed in a crowded room. My throat closed and opened. Daryl drifted to my shoulder without touching. The rain softened for a heartbeat as if the sky leaned in to hear better. I could feel the barn behind me holding its old warm breath. We didn't run. We didn't go back inside either. We stood a minute with the rain tick-ticking off the edge of the metal roof, letting the night rearrange the furniture in our heads. Then the generator coughed once, twice, like a smoker clearing a bad thought. The yard light stuttered and the small bulb over the pump dropped to amber. Daryl said he'd check the main feed at the box, and I told him I'd look at the portable under the lean-to by the woodpile. Splitting up didn't feel smart, but the kind of smart that keeps you sitting still is a cousin to giving up. So we moved. The gravel path had turned to a slow-moving mirror. Each step let the cold soak right through my boots until my socks found a new definition of wet. The flashlight beam hung in the rain like a white stick of chalk being erased as I drew with it. I played it ahead of me steady, making a cone my mind could live inside. The generator hunkered where it always hunkered, under the slanted tin between the wood stacked like a wall and the coil of extension cords. The air smelled of damp fuel and sawdust and something else, a faded version of that sour musk that had gotten into the house. enough to tighten the corners of my eyes. Something small shifted in the shadow between the leg of the generator and the slats of the woodpile. Not the rabbit hunch of a cat, not the flit of a raccoon. This was a whole little person of a movement, shoulders first, then the rest, like a child caught out past lights out. It crouched with its back to me, rain sliding off a dark pelt that wasn't fur like a dog but had a way of laying flat and then standing up in the gusts, a living field. One hand, if hand is the word, rested on the braided metal of the ground wire. Long fingers too long with pads that looked clean and pale in the flashlight. The other hand hovered, flexing, the head tilted, listening to the thrum inside the machine like it had found a heart beating in a wall and wanted to understand it. I didn't say a word. My body had the sense to go still. The way you go still when a yearling deer steps inside an orchard and you don't want to punish its courage. The small figure raised its head a fraction and breathed, and the breath came out as sound. Not a cry, not a grunt. A chain of rounded syllables that brushed against meaning and slipped. The mouth shaped the space where words live without landing on one. Pitch climbed like it was pretending a question, then fell like a lullaby remembered wrong. It tried again, a little faster, as if copying a rhythm it had heard from far away. Something human but strained, airless, like the chest making it didn't quite know how to time breath to sound. My name hovered at the edge of it, or maybe that's what I wanted to hear. The rain filled the distance between us. The generator ticked as if to mark the beats. I eased the flashlight a hair to the left and the beam caught the side of a small face. Not flat like a bear, not long like a deer. The angle from brow to cheek had a human logic to it, and the hair around the ear was short and slicked to the skull by water. The nostrils flared wide, drawing in every thread of the night. The lips, yes, lips, peeled back a little, and the teeth were small and square and normal. That normal startled me more than anything. I took a half step. The gravel muttered. The small figure went rigid, then melted backward with a speed that surprised me. Not headlong flight, a clean withdrawal into a deeper wedge of shadow, a drawing down from sight the way a hand slips out of a glove. The beam swung, reflex, not plan, and found a different shape that hadn't been there a second before. It filled the space between the lean-to and the black wall of trees like a door you didn't know existed had just opened onto night itself. Broad shoulders, wet hair flattened to a hide that drank light and gave back almost none. Arms that hung past where my arms end, a chest that rose once, slow, and let the rain run in sheets off the sternum. I knew it was looking at me even before the beam angled enough to catch the eyes. They weren't glowing on their own. They were two ovals holding the reflection of my light, and the hot copper of it made them look like metal left too long in a forge. They didn't blink right away. When they did, it was slow, vertical sweep somehow, like shutters. My mouth knew how to dry out faster than the weather could. My heartbeat found the barn's big bell note and kept time. No part of me believed this was a costume. No part of me believed I could run faster than whatever this was if it wanted me gone. The figure stood exactly where the edge of the gravel met the first fringe of cedar needles, not 1 inch closer, not 1 inch back. The line mattered. I felt it in my ankles. I felt it in my teeth. Behind the bigger body, off to the right, something small exhaled again and adjusted its weight. A tiny scrape of nail on tin. The big one didn't turn. It tracked me, not with a predator's forward lean, but with a kind of locked posture I recognized from cattle at the fence line when a dog runs hard and stops. Containment, not strike, a warning that understood where warning ends. Rain slicked my jacket to my wrists. The flashlight burned a white circle into a rib that rose and fell like tide. 3 knocks rolled faint from the tree line, spaced the same way as before, and this time I didn't have to search for the source. It came from just behind the big one, slightly left, as if the woods themselves were tapping their own chest. I could feel the porch rail under my fingers, even though I was 20 yards from the porch. Memory makes handles when your brain can't. The generator coughed again, then steadied at a lower hum. Somewhere over my shoulder, Daryl called my name, not a shout, more the shape of my name pushed through rain to reach me gently. I didn't answer. I was a wire carrying current, and too much touching would ground me out. The small figure made another string of soft syllables that stacked themselves like stones in a creek and then toppled quietly. The big one's eyes held the red of the light, not brighter, not dimmer, as if it had decided that light was mine and it could borrow a little only as long as I let it. Lightning split the cloud miles away and bleached the pasture into an X-ray. For a blink, I saw detail. The long, wet drape of hair across a shoulder blade, the thickness of the wrist, the way water ran off the knuckles in clean lines, the slight turn of a foot that wasn't a foot the way mine is, but planted with a purpose that looked ancient and exact. The line between gravel and needles shone like a rule. When the dark rushed back in, the big body hadn't moved. Neither had I. I lowered the beam by instinct, not to blind it, and the copper faded from the eyes until they were just dark, patient. The counting rose once more, farther off now, as if the trees repeated it to themselves. 3, 2, 1. It curled into the thunder and rode away toward the ravine. The small one breathed, a hiss, and the big one answered with a sound low enough to be felt more than heard, a floorboard of a sound, steadying. My hand shook so finely the circle of light trembled, a white coin quivering on a chest that belonged to a story I had never been told, but had somehow always known. The rain made a curtain, and then, with the kind of clarity nights like this sometimes grant, I understood there were rules in this place older than our fences and our lamps, and something out there had decided to speak them in a language I could almost catch. I stood on my side of the line and waited for the next beat. By late morning, the fog thinned into gauze and light came in at an angle that made everything look like a memory. We'd sunk a line of fresh cedar stakes just after sunrise, a rough boundary from the corner of the barn to the first sweep of firs, more ceremony than defense. The soil gave easy after the rain. Each post took 2 hits too many because I needed the sound. And then, as if it had been waiting for us to draw the chalk, it was there. Not sneaking, not darting, standing. It held the far side of our line like it had always owned it. 1 foot just behind the run of stakes, toes angled slightly outward the way a big man rests his weight when he's settled in. Shoulders square, head tilted a fraction, not in threat, not in submission, in assessment. Between us, the boundary breathed, timber needles shifting, wet grass laid flat and glittering, a soft steam rising where sun touched sodden earth. Light combed through its coat and found 1,000 strands, each throwing back a thread of silver. The hair was thick and heavy and rain-dried in patches. Under it moved something dense. It could have crossed with one long step. It didn't. I kept still because stillness felt like the only language that wouldn't be misread. Daryl eased up beside me, slow, hands open, shoulders low, like he'd just walked a skittish mare to a gate. The world narrowed to the stakes, the wet earth, and the shape on the other side. The dog didn't bark. The swallows didn't dive. Even the wind chose to move high in soft clicks across the tops of the firs. A choir I could feel but not see. The smell that had haunted the coop lay faint on the air now, resin and musk and something mineral that made me think of damp rock. My heart found a deliberate rhythm and kept it. We held that geometry for I don't know how long. At some point, the crunch of gravel said a cruiser was coming up the lane. The sound landed with an apology and kept coming anyway. Trooper Hale swung the door with his usual careful economy, hat in place even though the air didn't know if it was sun or rain. He scanned the yard like he was scanning a roadside accident, and the face he keeps for folks on their worst days slid into place. He saw the stakes. He saw us. He followed our gaze to the tree line and then took in the prints in the damp where the gravel gives way to grass. They weren't prints the way a field guide loves prints. They were deep, human-wide ovals with a mid-foot pressure that made my skin pull tight again. You could see the transfer, heel to ball. No splay like claws, no stagger like bear. A measured, upright stride that stopped dead at our line and set one foot carefully behind it as if to swear an oath. Hale let his eyes ride over the shape standing there and did that cop thing, my scene, my rules, my report. He squatted next to the nearest depression, pinched a bit of the edge, sniffed out of habit, and stood. "Big bear," he said easy, keeping his tone like he was handing me a warm blanket. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. He looked at the sky, then the siding, then the break in the fence we'd never repaired right. Rain pulls shapes you don't expect. The way weight lands on wet ground, it'll fool you from a distance. He was careful not to look at the long, clean line of the stride that had nothing to do with a shuffling four-legged gait. He was careful not to look at the way the ground beyond the line hadn't been touched at all. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to name what watched us without blinking. Some truths don't belong to paperwork. Hale said he'd swing the bottom pasture, check for sign, talk to Bob about his cattle staying off the tree line. He made a note I couldn't read from where I stood. Then he radioed something that sounded like normal life and walked the perimeter like a man proving a point to himself. When he was gone, I circled toward the southeast corner where the alder leans over the fence like it's peering into our business. The bark there had a raw new wound at shoulder height, fresh strips of outer bark peeled back in long, clean ribbons that hadn't had time to dry and curl. Underneath, the pale cambium shone, wet as bone. Cut into that pale field were marks, not scratches, not random. 3 arcs bent toward each other like small moons with 2 solid bars laid across them as if to hold them shut. The sap had bled in beads along each groove and was already beating into amber. The cuts had depth. A blade hadn't made them. Something wider, blunter, stronger. I knew the feel of myth when it brushed past. I went to the mudroom and found the paperback I keep for local stories, the one with dog-eared pages on logging marks and old surveyor's codes, a glossary of things men used to cut into trees when trees were the only bulletin board. I flipped with a finger I hadn't realized was trembling. Not this. Not quite. There were warnings. There were claim lines. There were notches for a trap set and notches for a trap sprung. I found a sketch that lived near those, a symbol used by a coast tribe to mark a place of bad ground, looped curves with a gate across them to mean don't. The picture in the book didn't match exactly, but the echo held. Boundary, hazard, law. I traced the wet cuts with my eyes and felt something unclench and clench at the same time. I was being told a thing. Not a secret exactly. A rule. I let my hand hover above the bark and then pulled it back because touching felt like speaking out of turn. The figure by the stakes had shifted, not closer, just a redistribution of weight, a new angle of shoulder. It watched the way I watched the mark, as if the tree was the actual conversation and we were both trying to get it right. Daryl called me from the edge of the pasture where the grass had a new wound of its own. A drag line. Metal on wet earth makes a kind of straight that nature doesn't. A flattened groove ran from the corner of the barnyard toward the timber, cutting across deer track, stepping over gopher mounds like a ruler. Every few yards, the groove deepened and widened where weight had rested and been lifted again. In one of those cups, a fleck of gray paint lay in the mud like a scale. It had the dull flatness you see on equipment that's lived a hard life. He followed the line into the trees, pausing at each deeper dent the way you'd pause at mile markers on a road you don't know. I fell in behind him, the boundary pulling at the back of my jacket as we crossed it, like a polite hand asking if I was sure. The moment we entered, the air changed. Cooler under the firs, damp and layered. The floor gave a little. Years of needles turned to duff under every step. The drag line turned down an old logging trace that barely remembered its name, its banks softened and knit with sword ferns. Fern fronds shook our pant legs with dew. We came on the cabin the way you come on a thing you half expect and hope not to see. It sat in a small flat between two mossy stumps. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows gone to black. A long ago hunter's blind that time had decided not to swallow. A rusted stovepipe still pointed into nothing like a finger from a fist. The door leaned off a single hinge and moved when the wind breathed through the clearing. A strip of orange flagging fluttered from a nail in the eave, fresh against all that rot. The drag line ran right to the threshold and disappeared over it. The groove in the moss stopped where floorboards began. Inside, the smell hit first. Not a dead thing, not rot, green, resin. A cut Christmas smell made bigger and somehow intimate, as if a whole hillside had been brought in and arranged around a single careful idea. The back corner was piled with fir boughs, layered and shaped into a bowl big enough to hold me twice over. The cut ends were fresh, sap still wet, needles springy under a light press of my boot. On top lay things that didn't grow here. A shred of an old flannel shirt in red and black, a length of tarp cut clean, a corner of a feed sack, faded letters ghosting through the dirt. I picked up the flannel with 2 fingers and watched water thread from it back into the pile. The floorboards under the small broken window had a stain the color of dark tea. It radiated from a knothole toward the center of the room, a spilled flower, fresh enough to gleam. It wasn't much. It wasn't old. It had that whisper-clean edge that blood has before it ferries iron into the air. My throat found that metallic taste again, and I swallowed it down, counting breaths the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder. Small footprints, if footprints is the word, freckled the dust near the nest. Not deep, not clawed, just the suggestion of pads and weight and hesitation. We stood very quietly, each of us mapping without saying a thing. The shape at the stakes, the symbol on the altar, the line gouged by metal from our yard to here. The nest that wasn't a bed so much as a sanctuary. The stain that said hurt but not whose. Daryl crouched, tilted his head, and set 2 fingers near the edge of the stain like a doctor checking a pulse that isn't there. His eyes went to the dark along the back wall where the drag marks ended. The end of the line was a busted trap jaw, steel teeth blunted with age, chain chewed, the stake bent. A piece of ground wire, just like the kind off our generator, lay coiled next to it, braided with a short length of nylon rope that had once been orange. The quiet in that room had weather. I could hear water drip off the eaves at the back. I could hear a chickadee try out 2 notes and give up. I could hear something adjust its breathing just beyond the doorframe, not us. Then from the trees east of the clearing, 3 hard knocks rolled across the trunks. Even, spaced, certain. The sound came through the walls, through my ribs, and settled into the boards we stood on. I waited without realizing I was waiting for the answer I'd come to expect. The second set of knocks, the echo that proves a call is a conversation. It didn't come. The clearing held its breath and held it. The absence of that second voice made the hair on my arms rise all over again, slow like grass under a cold wind. Daryl lifted his head, listening so still it hurt to watch. I looked at the nest, the stain, the broken trap jaw on the floor, and the place where the drag line ended. The air in the doorway thickened, not with a body, but with a feeling I didn't have a name for. Something that lives close to grief and just as close to warning. 3 more knocks reached us from farther out. Same rhythm, older somehow, as if the trees were repeating for themselves what they couldn't get answered. I put my hand against the door jamb to steady myself and felt the whole frame exhale once, or maybe that was me. Then the clearing shifted back into birds and drip and leaf murmur, and the room seemed smaller than it had when we came in. Or maybe the world had just moved a notch farther away, and I knew the line we'd drawn with cedar stakes was about to mean more than we thought. Night came down hard and flat, the kind of dark that presses on windows like a hand. Wind ran a steady line through the firs and the yard light through a pale circle that looked tired. We had checked the traps we don't set, counted the things you can count, and told ourselves the day had been strange but survivable. Then the generator hiccuped, a single cough, another. The lights brightened as if swallowing air and then collapsed to a weak ember. One more stutter like a dying star, and everything went out at once. The kitchen, the yard light, the little green dot on the surge strip that usually glows through anything. The silence landed like a lid. I felt it before I named it. A pressure at the base of the throat down behind the sternum where panic likes to park. Not sound, not exactly. A slow, deep shudder rolling through the cabinetry, through the floor joists, through ribs. The mugs in the cupboard chattered once on their saucers. The dog didn't bark. His ears went slick and flat, and he pressed himself under the table like a storm had taught him manners. My heart answered the pressure with a counterbeat and then lost the argument. The air felt thick, like altitude you didn't climb to. I stood still and let the house tell me what it knew. Out on the porch, the dark had a weight I could taste. Rain hadn't started yet, but the air carried that metallic tang storms cart in ahead of them. I lifted the small flashlight and painted a weak cone across the gravel. The generator sat under the lean-to like a sleeping animal, all corners and familiar dents. It didn't smoke, it didn't hum, it just held still. Somewhere in the trees, something spoke under hearing, a long, low-threaded boom that rolled through me more than around me, and a second later my chest trembled again like someone had put a flat palm there and held it. Counting lives and beats is what you do out here. Calves, clocks, the intervals between thunder and lightning. This was counting of another kind, and it chose my bones. We keep a cheap camera on the eaves because habit is a kind of fence. It's nothing fancy, just a little eye that watches the yard light and gives me an excuse to back up what I feel. Later, when we scrubbed through the footage, the picture showed nothing but black and the drifting ghost of a moth wing. The audio track looked like quiet too, until we dragged the timeline across slow and found a fat band squatting down below the bottom of what the mic is proud to hear. No musical breath in it, no voice. Just that steady, heavy line under 20 hertz where our ears give up and the body learns something alone. It made a kind of sense out of the way my own chest had felt held. Daryl moved like a man who knows the footprint of his house in his sleep. He took the big flashlight and handed me the headlamp. We split the distance between generator and breaker box, two small cones of light feeling their way through a night that didn't want to be touched. The metal casing of the generator felt cold and slick under my fingers. The choke and fuel valves stood where they should, but the main cable had a new scar, a clean slice in the sheath that bared a braid of bright copper like a smile with too many teeth. Tape we hadn't put there held two clips in place. The clips ran to a shoebox-sized thing with heat vents and a cheap plastic handle that wasn't weathered enough to live here. A battery pack lay behind it, warm to the touch in a cold yard. The rig wasn't meant to power anything. It was meant to sing into the bones of the night. I crawled under the porch with the headlamp pinched against my forehead, belly on gravel, breath fogging the underside of the deck boards. The smell under there was earth and mouse and a faint overlay of chemical I couldn't place, sweet and bitter at the same time. The beam found metal shoved just beyond where anyone would think to reach on a casual look. Jaws big enough to eat a boot, old steel, newer springs, chain snaked back on itself like a threat taking a nap. It had the same blunt teeth as the busted one in the hunter's cabin, but this one was tuned, oiled, ready. A plastic case nearby held darts I recognized from vet work. Aluminum bodies, orange caps, the little rubber skirts you bite off in training and never forget the taste of. 3 were empty. 2 were full, liquid silver riding the glass when I turned them. The labels were gone. A battery lantern without a brand sat face down beside a roll of black duct tape. And under my wrist the dirt wore the smooth shine of hands that had been here longer than a single night. That was the moment the night rearranged itself. The shape in the trees wasn't our only neighbor. Whatever stood at our boundary and chose not to cross, it hadn't twisted our hinge, hadn't wired our generator to hum the house, hadn't stashed teeth and sleep in a box under our boards. I backed out slowly, dirt in my shirt, headlamp throwing small frantic circles across joists and nails like constellations. On the windless night, the forest still made that sub-bass murmur. I could taste it. I could feel the hairs on my forearms lean toward it. I could feel anger arrive like a color. I knew this wasn't an argument between us and whatever watched us from the firs. Someone was trying to make it one. We did something that sounds foolish and felt true. I went to the alder where the mark had been cut and sat on the lowest rung of the fence with a pocket knife and a piece of bark I had set aside. The strip was thick, cedar red, soaked through but still strong. I pressed the knife in and carved slow, following the memory in my hands. 3 rounded arcs like small moons laid in a row, 2 bars drawn across to say a gate. Not perfect, not book neat, true enough. A little resin rose and made the cut edges shine. When I finished, I held it up to the yard light that wasn't on and to the sky that was stingy with stars, and the piece seemed to take breath. We wired it to the gate at the top of the lane where everyone stops a beat without thinking, even if they've lived here 20 years. The wind didn't take it. The night read it. I could feel that in my bones the same way I had felt the pressure under the house. I didn't say what I wanted it to say out loud. I just set my hand flat against it once, the way you touch a horse's neck before you ask it to listen. And then we went inside and made a list of the things to move in the morning and the phone calls to make and the ways to see our house we hadn't used yet. Dawn came soft and mean. It turned the fog into glass and laid frost across the railing just enough to squeak under a fingertip. I opened the door and looked down before I looked out because mornings had taught me not to take my attention for granted. On the mat lay a rabbit, whole, clean, placed with the head toward the threshold and the front paws folded like someone had done this before and knew where Grace sits. No blood, no torn fur. I reached and felt the weight through the mat, 2 pounds and change, and the simple gravity of it almost undid me. Beside it, leaned against the step, another piece of bark, smaller than the one we'd hung, cut with the same 3 arcs and gate, but now a single short diagonal mark sliced through the top bar, a fracture in the rule. It felt like an answer. It felt like a word I almost knew. I held the little tablet in my palm and let the edge bite so I wouldn't float. Daryl took the rabbit the way you take an offering you understand enough to respect. We set it in the shade and covered it with a towel and said thank you with the door open and our hands plain. Then the roof spoke. It wasn't a squirrel scramble. It wasn't rain learning the pitch of the tin. It came as a heavy shift and a thud that settled, like a shoulder throwing weight onto rafters. Dust fell out of the light fixture in the hallway in a soft confetti drift. The dog went under the bed so fast he left his nails in the runner. Another slow step from the corner over the kitchen toward the middle of the house. And then a stop that told me the body above us had length to spare. Daryl was already moving. Ladder out of the mudroom, motion small and exact because big ones break things you can't fix. He set it at the hatch and pushed the panel up with the back of his wrist. Cold air poured down, sweet with insulation and wood and the faint acid of mouse life. He lifted himself through, and I followed to the second rung and held the ladder with both hands because faith has hardware. The beam of his light cut a thin page across the attic. The rafters made their long, high ribs. The place where dust should have held its own showed a track instead. Big wet prints that had soaked the gray into black. Not shoe, not boot. The smudged wide ovals we'd seen in mud now lifted onto our boards, the midfoot pressure dark where a heel should stamp, each step set exactly in line with the next so clean a plumb bob would be proud. They came from the far eave where a limb from the big fir kisses the roofline. Crossed towards center and then angled, deliberate, to the short wall above our bedroom. The smears shone in the beam. The water hadn't dried yet. My jaw found a tremble so fine I felt it in my teeth. Daryl didn't speak. He followed the line with the light like a man reading a sentence carved into stone. The last mark pressed near the small attic vent that looks down over our bed, and there it paused. The dust around it had a faint swirl like breath makes on a cold day when it hits glass. The house held still with us. The woods waited just outside the skin of the walls, and somewhere out past the fence a low, low note moved through the timber and into everything we owned. I thought of the rabbit on the mat. I thought of the broken stroke across the gate mark. I thought of the box under the porch and the way it had been wired to sing the night wrong. Daryl set the beam on the last wet print a heartbeat longer than felt sane. Then he pulled the light back slow and the dark healed over in the rafters. And the attic breathed once, and the ladder rattled under my hands. And the day began whether we were ready or not. Sometime after midnight, the wind quit pretending to be weather and turned into a listener. The yard went still in that careful way that makes every small sound show its face. I woke because metal made a tight little cry outside, the kind a hinge gives when a stranger tests it. I lay there counting heartbeats against the quiet and heard it again. Closer to a whine this time, like something was twisting and running out of patience. The dog lifted his head, didn't growl, just watched the dark. I slid out of bed and let my feet find the cold boards by memory. The house carried my weight to the back door without complaint. I eased it open and the night laid itself out flat and close. The truck sat nose out by the woodpile, chrome dim under a thinning moon. The driver's side mirror should have been a simple rectangle of dark. It wasn't. It stood cocked at a wrong angle, pointing up like a periscope trying to find a sky. A smear of damp reflected the porch light that wasn't on, which made no sense until my little flashlight threw its thin coin of white across the glass. 5 arcs, not prints in powder, prints in shine. Something had put its weight there and turned the casing until the mirror squealed in its socket. Each finger left a dull amber sheen like resin rubbed into a tool handle, and at the center of the palm the skin had a pad, a flat oval that caught light the way a well-worn step does. Daryl came behind me fast and quiet, the old lever action in his hands because fear is a habit out here and so is discipline. He took one look at the mirror and let his breath go slow, then swung his gaze to the tree line. The beam picked up the silver run of wet blackberry cane, the black of the cedar trunks, the low fog laying itself like a ground rule across the grass. And then it found eyes, not glow in the dark, not magic, just the way even a small light makes copper live inside a pupil when it has something to bounce off. The eyes didn't dart, they held. They had patience the way a river has patience with a rock. He raised the rifle because muscle memory is older than language. The butt settled into the groove of his shoulder. The barrel slid until it wrote a straight line on the night. The eyes did not flinch. They widened a fraction the way a person widens their eyes to show they are awake and not trying to fool you. My mouth said his name without force. He didn't take his eyes off the eyes. A beat. 2. The gun went soft and grew heavier all at once. He lowered it until the barrel pointed at wet grass, not at a chest that breathed like tide. We stood there like people at a fence line, each on our side, each deciding whether to prove we could be the first to move. The mirror held the smear of that hand like a photograph I hadn't agreed to take. I couldn't stand the story the truck was telling about us, so I changed the one on the house. I took the strip of cedar I'd carved and set aside, 3 nested arcs and 2 bars, the sign I'd learned from the alder, and I hung it on a nail by the front door where anyone who knew how to read would have to read it. Not perfect. True. The knife mark showed the little shiver of my hand from earlier. I pressed my palm flat to it for a second, cedar cool and slightly damp, and I wished without words the way you do when you touch a thing made to speak for you. Sleep did not come back. The night found its low hum and held it. Just before first light, when the sky is an idea and not a color, I went to the mudroom for the box of spare screws and found a different box tucked behind it. Shallow and cedar, the kind you put old letters in when you don't mean to part with them. The house came with its ghosts. This felt like one of them. Inside lay a square of flannel as thin as paper, a photograph of the porch from 20 years ago, same steps, fewer dents, and a bundle of pages folded into an envelope with our address written in a hand that belonged to someone who made lists and comforted children. I slid the papers free, and the smell of old cupboard dust and cedar chips rose up, clean and tired. The letter started like people start letters when they think maybe they shouldn't write them. I know how this sounds. I know the face you might make. But this was our address and not a stranger's, and the voice knew the shape of this place. He talked about an autumn when elk bugled too early and rain came in sheets, about setting a coyote trap for a neighbor who swore a thief was pulling hens right through wire, about finding something in the morning that was not coyote. Small, hurt. Not a baby in the way we think of babies, but young in the way bones and breath tell you young. He said he'd stood with 1 foot on either side of the line that day. The line between what you say at church and what you do with your hands when the living is in front of you. He pried the jaws apart with a tire iron, and his whole weight and the little thing's foot came free in a surge of crying that sounded like all the words a mouth doesn't yet have. For a month after, there were gifts at his step, trout laid clean on a folded leaf, a spray of wildflowers rooted in moss, once a rabbit set with its paws just so, once a fist-sized rock striped with quartz like a piece of bone from the earth. The last line was for whoever lived here next. If you ever see the sign on the trees, if you ever smell that smell, be careful how you answer. They hear more than we say. I let the pages sit in my lap and watched the morning try to make peace with the night. The story in those lines fit the weight of the rabbit on our mat, fit the cut mark on our gate, fit the steady look in eyes that gave us plenty of room and asked for room back. It also fit the broken trap jaw we'd found and the tuned one under our porch that had not been set by anything that moves on 2 mid-foot steps. Patterns are a kind of mercy. They give your brain a place to put the ache. Bob pulled in around 8 with a couple of salt blocks in the back like an excuse. Neighbor courtesy is a religion here. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his hat shoved back, looking at the mirror like it was a prank he refused to admire. "Damn kids," he said, because that's a safe sentence even when there are no kids for miles. We thanked him for the blocks, and he asked if he could borrow a charger because his phone wouldn't hold past lunch. Daryl went to grab the spare from the junk drawer. Bob set his phone on the counter and the screen woke up to a message he hadn't cleared. Not my business, not my house's either. But light does what light does. Numbers glowed a clean blue we both recognized as coordinates because anyone who's ever called a vet or a tow in the back country has typed numbers into a map and watched a dot appear. The numbers sat there like a dare. I felt Daryl see them without moving. He has a map of this place laid across the back of his eyes. Those digits lined up with the logging trace we'd taken 2 days before. The one that led to the old cabin with the nest and the stain. He looked at Bob's face and then down again and then back up, quick and easy, like someone looking to see if the stove is still on when it's plain it's off. Bob laughed at something he said about batteries being a conspiracy and took his phone back before the charger paired. He left fast for someone who had nowhere urgent to be. The sound of his truck fell off the lane and into the trees. Between the two of us, we didn't say the word we'd both earned. There's a sharpness to suspicion that cuts you even when you think you're holding it by the handle. We made a new coupe that afternoon because survival is sometimes just a way to show the day you're back. We set it closer to the house, inside our line of stakes under the reach of the yard light and the big maple that's lost 3 limbs and refuses to give up. Wire tight, corners squared, a door stout enough to settle a thought. I kept the letter in my pocket like a talisman I didn't believe in and couldn't let go of. Every so often I touched it and the paper gave under my thumb like an old friend. Evening came down in thin layers and every layer hummed a little. The deer moved early, slipping through the edge of the pasture 2 at a time like they'd practiced it. The air carried that resin tang again, not strong, just there like someone had opened a very small jar. I checked the new latch one more time because compulsion is a cousin to hope. The dog wove around my legs and then stopped dead, one paw lifted like a pointer. The hair along his spine rose up and laid back down in waves, unsure what language to use. Something shifted beyond the corner of the coop, not big enough to take the night with it, big enough to ask for it. I lifted the flashlight and kept it low. The beam skated across the new boards, across the damp strap of the hinge, and landed on a shape that was not shape until it turned its head. 20 feet. That's as far as you tell kids to throw a ball and not hit a window. Close enough to count breaths. The small figure stood half-turned, one hand on the edge of the coop where the grain dust clings. Hair lay flat from mist and then stood up where a breeze picked at it. The eyes took the light and did not mind it much. The mouth opened and the throat worked hard at a sound it seemed to practice and not own. It came out in a soft, broken chain that still managed to land where my name lives. Not clear, not human. The L and the E got swallowed. The rest found a way. S. The S dragged like a match pulled along too slow to catch. The sound wasn't asking. It wasn't warning. It was offering the shape of me back to me to show it had carried it from one night to this one. My chest did a small, disobedient thing and then settled like a hand had smoothed it. Behind the small one, deeper in the shade, the weight of a larger body shifted without leaving the dark, the way a parent in a doorway changes stance while letting a child speak. I said nothing because every word I could think of belonged to the wrong kind of story. I set my open hand out the way you set a flat palm for a skittish colt, and let the light drift until it touched the ground between us instead of the face that was working so hard. The mouth tried again, brighter this time, as if matching the beam. Yes. The dog let out one breath like a laugh and then held it. The yard light hummed. Somewhere out past the maple, the night gathered itself for whatever it thought would happen next, and I stood there with my name hanging in the air. A fragile bridge that could carry us or break, and I didn't know which it would choose. The night didn't fall so much as fold over us clean and fast, like somebody snapped a tarp across the sky and cinched it tight. The first thing wrong was the cattle. They don't spook easy here. They know the coyotes and the wind and the way rain rides the ridgeline, but somewhere between dusk and full dark they started bunching up against the corral rails, eyes rolling white, breath steaming like a train. The dog stretched into a long, thin howl that felt pulled out of him, and then the air itself went heavy and mean. Not loud, not a blast. A pressure that came up through the ground and climbed into my ribs like a slow elevator you can't step off. Cabinets rattled. The water glasses on the shelf kissed each other. The hair on my arms leaned toward the pasture. I knew that feeling now. They'd turned something on. I was already moving before my brain caught up. Headlamp, boots half-laced, jacket grabbed off a chair. Daryl hit the porch one stride ahead of me with a flashlight and that old fixed calm he wears like a tool belt. The yard light shivered and went from white to the kind of yellow that makes everything look sick. Out past the maple, the night had shape. Not headlights at first. That soft human shape of men working in the dark who think being quiet makes them invisible. 2, maybe 3. The cold scent of fuel hung low. Over the fence just beyond our cedar stakes, a squat shadow sat on the ground with a cable running to it. I knew the form even before the light found it. A portable generator feeding a shoebox-sized unit, the same kind we'd found signs of under our porch, set on a milk crate and humming at a pitch the ear doesn't honor but the bones do. The cattle pressed harder. Hooves beat a nervous tattoo that made the boards complain. The dog's howl turned from one note to a string of broken ones, not loud, just steady, like it physically hurt him to be quiet. In that pressure, it was hard to think. I couldn't find my breath where I keep it. My chest felt held. And in that held place on the far edge of the yard where the stakes drew their polite line, something bigger than my fear crossed it. It didn't creep. It didn't test. It charged the fence like a decision. The posts Daryl and I had sunk that morning looked like toys next to the length of it in motion. 1 long stride, 2, a sound like wet canvas being torn, and it cleared the top rail without touching it. Not toward us, not toward the house. It took a clean line for the hum, for the machine, for whatever was hurting the animals in a way sound didn't own up to. The beam of a light from the trees slid across its shoulder and showed the drape of hair blown flat by speed, water shaking off in silver threads. Thunder had not been forecast, but the night threw light anyway. White glare from a truck somewhere on the logging trace, then another, a sweep like a lighthouse. And in that sweep, men's bodies cut the rain in thick, blunt pieces. Someone shouted, a short syllable I didn't know, and metal hit metal. The shape barreled past our stakes, and I saw the choice it had made. Straight at the crate and the cable, not the house, not the corral, not me. It cut keys from the world and played one note, stop the hurt. When it hit the cable, the hum jumped a notch, then stuttered. The box skidded, the crate flipped, the generator coughed hard, and the air in my chest loosened just enough to be breath again. I ran for it because sometimes your body writes your orders for you. The headlamp shook a ragged cone over wet grass, then mud, then gravel. The infrasound box was just like the one we'd seen wired to our generator. Heat vents, cheap handle, a little LED that didn't care that we were all about to break. I smacked the switch because there are nights when finesse is an insult. The hum fell out of the world like a thing that had been pretending to be air. In its place came the small, old sounds the land makes when you stop hurting it. Fir needles ticking as they let go of rain. Wind finding its path down a draw and laying it back again. The slow, relieved shifting of 40 hooves as the herd remembered how to breathe. The relief lasted about a breath and a half. Headlights lanced the pasture as a rig down on the trace gunned it and swung wide. The light washed across faces and coats and the shiny, round bellies of gear. Not hunters, not loggers. Men built like the gym and jobs that let them leave when they want. One wore a hard hat with a light clipped on. Another had a canvas vest with pockets wrong for fishing and right for carrying whatever tonight required. They moved like they'd done this before. They moved like somebody had drawn them a map. Daryl shouted something I didn't catch over the thud of boots and the churn of an ATV connecting ruts into a road. I turned and saw his flashlight pin a shape just long enough for the night to grow a name around it. Bob. He wasn't in his old jacket. He wasn't in chore boots. He wore a camo shell he hadn't needed to own last week and a hat I'd never seen on him. brim pulled low, body angled as if he'd already decided which way he'd run when he needed to. He swung his light not at the men he'd come with, but straight into Daryl's eyes, hot and white. A flare at pistol range. Daryl flinched because he's human, because retinas are retinas, and because trust has reflexes you don't get to train. In the slice of that blindness, the other men slid past and the ATV fishtailed mud onto the fence, motor whining as it climbed the old road out. Bob clipped his light off a beat later and did a poor job pretending that had been an accident. The apology didn't make it to his mouth. It stalled out somewhere behind his teeth. Somewhere to my left, the Guardian's weight hit something I couldn't see, and the world answered with the ugly scream of steel under load. The sound crawled up my spine and set my jaw tight enough to ache. A shadow peeled out of shadow and made for the timber, moving with a speed that made the distance look shorter than it is. Behind me, the dog edged out from under the porch and took 2 brave steps before the night argued him back again. Then blue-white flashed across the low clouds, not lightning. Cruiser lights turning the fog into a pulsing ceiling. Tires crushed gravel on the lane. Trooper Hale's spotlight opened like a flower across the pasture and found what the dark had been sitting on. Under the alder where the old fence angles, a steel trap big enough to shame the one from the cabin lay staked in, jaw cocked, teeth blunt but plenty, chain welded to a T-post jammed into the wet ground. Beside it, a cheap plastic tackle box with its guts out, empty dart sleeves, a coil of orange nylon rope, syringes without labels, a pair of needle nose pliers shiny with recent use. The beam held on the mess, slid to the box I'd knocked over, ticked across the cable run to the generator, then lifted and cut through steam to land on the thing none of us could pretend not to see. It wasn't the big one. It was small. Small for what it was, and still too big to be in that trap without the whole world going wrong. One leg was caught mid-calf where you'd expect a heel in a human, and there is none, pinned in that awful V of iron that should have rusted to memory 30 years ago. The body threw weight back and pulled, then shoved forward and pushed, then tried to work side to side, all while a sound came out of its mouth that didn't belong anywhere but a nightmare or a nursery. Half sob, half call. A thin, tearing scream punched through with a note that wanted to be a name or a number. It clawed at the chain with hands that had done careful work the night before on my coupe and now raked at steel until blood made the metal sharp with smell. I was already moving before I knew I'd moved. The ground sloped slick toward the alder and I took it too fast, hit my knee, kept going, palms wet and gritty. The headlamp bounced wild pictures onto bark and trap and the small, desperate hands. The big one was there too, I knew it without seeing it. Felt it in the bend of air behind me, the way the night went suddenly taller, a ceiling raised, a room made wide. It didn't push me. It didn't pull me. It stood so close the heat off it lifted goose flesh from my neck. And in that heat was a low thread of sound I felt more than heard, steadying, pleading, "Don't make me show you what happens if you make me wait." Daryl slid in on my right with the bolt cutters we keep in the barn for fencing emergencies. Breath chopping, mouth set. Hale shouted my name and something procedural that meant he'd seen the darts and his job had arrived in his hands and his brain wanted to do it by the book. Bob ghosted the edge of the beam, moving fast toward the logging trace as if the cruiser light had reminded him he belonged somewhere else. The men with him were already engines and taillights and mud spray, already the memory of their boots in our field. The small one shrieked again and the sound broke in the middle like a voice changing, like a throat that hadn't learned the length of its own pain. It reached, palm open, not at me exactly, at the space where my name had lived between us the night before. A mouth can hold so much of a word without ever owning it. I set my hand out and the inches between us turned into a kind of glass I couldn't break with anything but the right motion. The trap jaw had been wired for strength and for spite. Daryl got the cutters on the spring and leaned his whole body into it. The metal groaned. Hale's beam steadied on the mechanism, his other hand radioing things into air that would be heard and recorded and misunderstood if we weren't careful. The big one's breath moved the hair at my temple without touching me, and every part of the night agreed on one thing. We were a second away from breaking open into something we couldn't take back. Then the small one cried in that awful, almost human way again, and I understood that the line we'd drawn with cedar stakes had just been ripped, and some lines, once torn, don't stitch the same. The scream cut in half and tried to make a word. It tore through the trees, then folded back into the throat it came from. I was on my knees before I knew my body had decided, hands in the cold mud, breath working like a pump that needed priming. The trap sat under the alder like a lesson we should have learned 30 years ago. Iron jaws gaping a mean, patient V, chains sunk deep into wet ground, a T-post hammered in by someone who didn't plan to stay and still wanted to leave a mark. In the beam of Trooper Hale's spotlight, the small one thrashed and then froze, chest going frantic under a pelt slicked dark with rain. Each small hand grabbed for steel and came away with a new line of red that steamed in the white light. Somewhere behind me, the big body stepped forward and the night altered in size. Not closer, larger. A wall that had chosen where it would stand. I lifted my palm and flattened it to the earth the way you quiet a spooked horse. The air coming off the big one carried heat and a low thunder that belonged inside a chest, not outside it. I found a patch of bare ground where the mud had been tamped by boots and hoof, and I dragged the tip of my finger through it. 3 round arcs like small moons in a row. 2 straight bars laid across them like a gate. The sign from the alder. The sign we'd hung at our own door, the sign the trees had already taught me to say. I drew slow so I wouldn't lie. The rain softened the edges, but the lines held. I tipped my chin to the trap and let my hand hover over the jaws. Open. Please. Behind me, Daryl's boots slid in for purchase and the cutters found the spring. He had the gun slung and forgotten down his back. He bent his whole life into the handles and grunted in a way I'd heard once before, when a calf came wrong and he had to choose between breaking a rib and saving a future. The springs moaned, teeth groaning against each other, the chain rattling in a rhythm that didn't belong in a field at night. Hale's light steadied on the hinge. Not on us, not on the big one. His other hand dropped, palm out, a signal he must use at Rex when bystanders rushed the scene. Easy, ease. He spoke my name in the way people use your name to keep you anchored. I've got you, the voice said without the words. I felt the draw of his training and the pull of his duty and a slightly shaky human heart inside all that, and for a strange second I loved him for being all of it at once. From the tree line something moved wrong, the shadow weight of men trying to shave time with quiet. I didn't turn. I heard an ATV cough to life on the logging trace and then shut down again when the driver remembered how sound works. You don't have to see greed to know the shape it gives a body. The small one made that almost name again, pitched high, then fell apart on the jagged breath that pain carves. The big one's growl rose just enough to carry a warning and then leveled into a note that pinned the moment in place. Not a threat. Not yet. A promise about what would happen if we chose badly. The cutters found their bite. The jaws fought to keep it. The chain jumped, popping the skin of the mud and throwing flecks into the air that glittered like filings in the cruiser beam. Daryl swore once, soft, then shifted stance and leaned with everything he had. The metal gave a fraction. I could feel the give run through the ground into my knees. I slid my hand under the upper jaw and pushed it back with my palm because you can borrow strength from a stranger if you lend your skin to it. The hinge screamed, and then the jaws surrendered a width of hand. The small leg yanked once and didn't clear. I shook my head and the small one went still again. Teeth bared, not at me, but at the idea of stillness. It trembled so hard the mud around the fur shook. Hale stepped up on my left, light held out, not into the eyes, into the mechanism. His other hand set gently on the chain, keeping it honest. Over his shoulder, the dark cracked into blue one more time as another cruiser came over the rise. The shortwave on his vest hissed names and numbers and the kind of phrases people put into reports when they need the paper to say exactly what the air did. Darts visible, loaded equipment present, do not advance. He didn't say what we all felt in our bones. This was medicine used like a weapon, and the night wanted it stopped. The trap let go. Not all at once. Enough! The small one jerked and the jaw pinched shin before it realized it had lost and then slurred open the rest of the way. I slid the steel back and Daryl dragged the chain aside so nothing could clap shut again by accident or malice. The small one collapsed forward and then caught itself on both hands, breathing with a hiccup that didn't know how to stop. I saw the leg where the teeth had kissed, not mangled. Bruised deep as thunder, punctures that would need clean water and time. It dragged the foot out of the iron and curled it under, protective, the way kids sit on their own hands when they're scared they'll touch a stove. The big body took one step that lifted the ground. It didn't scoop the small one the way a person might. It placed itself like a door and let the small one shelter in its shadow. One big hand held low with the palm open. A gesture I recognized from bridges and barns and horses that have learned to trust to a point and no more. I breathed out without telling my lungs they had permission, and only then did my ears admit that the herd had gone quiet, each cow standing with her head low, chewing, checking in with the night like a wife checks in with a room before she walks into it. Hale's backup rolled to a stop along the lane, and the yard became a slice of daytime in the wrong place. The men in the trees retreated into their own shadows. Not all. The ATV that had coughed earlier changed its mind and tried a rush. Hale turned his light and his voice on at the same time, and both were bigger than the machine. Stay where you are. Not shouted, hammered. The engine throttled down in that sulky way motors have when a decision gets made for them. Somewhere beyond the curve, someone swore and kicked something metal because kicking is easier than surrender and just as foolish. We waited. It felt like waiting an hour and a half. It was the space of 10 slow breaths and the time it takes adrenaline to stop trying to write your life for you. The small one made a soft chain of sound that moved in circles instead of lines. The big one answered with a low vibration I could feel in my teeth, steadying, slowing. Yes. Daryl took a step back and set the cutters down, palms out at his sides. I did the same, my fingers mud black and shaking. Hale lowered the angle of his light until it rode a path from trap to lane and not through any chest that didn't need to be pierced. The county showed up the way it always does. Another cruiser, another set of boots, the professional quiet of people who learned long ago that voices make messes. Hale briefed in 2 sentences that didn't include the word we were all trying not to use. He marched the younger deputy through the hardware, trap, infrasound box, battery rig, dart sleeves with no labels. He pointed out the fresh digging around the T-post. He did not point at the shadow that was still a wall. He didn't have to. The deputy's eyes knew where not to land. The night bent again, this time under the weight of headlights coming up from the logging trace. Slow, as if returning casually never fooled anybody and they were going to try it anyway. A pickup rolled past our mailbox like it had a right to be reading our name in the dark. Another truck idled at the bend. The ATV eased out with the engine barely above a whisper. Hale touched the mic on his shoulder and said a string of numbers that mean places to people who live here. The backup moved like chess. The lane sealed front and back. The trucks tried to turn around and discovered geometry doesn't take bribes. I recognized the second silhouette before the hat came off. Bob took one step forward, hands up. That slow smile he uses when he's selling a story he's told himself too often to remember it's a lie. Hale didn't buy it. He had the cuffs on two of them before they finished the first sentence about fishing or coyotes or kids. The other two were made of flight and got none. The deputy collected the box, the generator, the tackle kit full of darts, the nylon rope, bagged, tagged. The quiet afterward held the shape of something finally named and not said. We didn't cheer. You don't cheer when the land has watched you. Hale looked at me and then at the big shadow and then down at the sign in the mud and nodded once like someone who has added a new word to his private dictionary and intends to keep it safe. He told us he'd write what he could write and keep what he could keep off paper. He said trespass and poaching and unlawful use into the night like pen strokes and then let the rest drift where the trees could take it. Toward morning, after the lane belonged to birds again and the cruiser lights had stopped flickering in my head, I opened the door to air that had reset. On the mat lay another rabbit, clean, placed with a care that felt like ceremony. Beside it, a ring from the trap's hinge, a slice of steel worked loose, streaked with rust and a smear of dark that was not ours. The ring sat on the rabbit's front paws like an offering laid with a story, return and trust. We took both in with hands that didn't deserve them yet. Later, when the sun had almost decided it could be a sun, I walked the line of our cedar stakes with the strip of bark we'd hung at the gate and felt the small shift in the air that told me we weren't done speaking. On the alder near the corner, the old sign still shone wet in the cuts. Below it, carved fresh into meat white cambium, was a pattern I'd never seen. Two circles not side by side but overlapping. The lens shape between them thickened and smoothed as if a thumb had pressed there again and again. Under that, not a bar and not a slash but a small curve, a cradle mark, holding the whole. Resin bled and caught the light like honey. I lifted my hand and didn't touch it because some images need to be left alone long enough to say themselves. The breeze came down the draw with the smell of fur and creak and wet iron from last night's metal lying in the grass. The herd moved as one to follow shade. The dog leaned against my leg and sighed. From far back in the timber, 3 knocks rolled and faded, not a challenge now. Not quite a farewell either, more like a promise that there would be more rules to learn. And I stood at our line and listened until the sound became part of my own ribs and held there, waiting for whatever night would ask of us next. Morning brought a clean cold that made the world honest. I walked the fence line with my hands in my pockets and my breath making little ghosts that didn't last. The alder where the bark had been cut still bled sap in clear beads. The fresh marks were simple and stubborn, 2 circles carved so they overlapped, a lens of pale wood where they crossed, a small curved notch under them like a hand under a bowl. It didn't read like warning. It didn't read like victory. It read like a deal. In my head, I kept saying the same word and it sat right inside my chest. Coexist. I pressed my thumb near the edge and resin slicked my skin. It smelled like pitch and rain and a kind of promise I didn't know how to keep yet but wanted to try. Hale came up the lane an hour later, engine off halfway, letting gravel sound like rain so the house wouldn't startle. He took his hat off in the kitchen like our table was a church pew and wrapped both hands around the mug I handed him. He didn't look at the window. He didn't look at the yard. He looked at me the way you look at a person you've decided to trust with a specific piece of your life and not the rest. He told us what he was writing. Trespass, illegal trapping, unlawful use of a device to harass livestock, interference with property. He ran through the list like laying planks across a creek one by one so we could cross. He said he wasn't including anything that didn't belong in a courtroom. He said he'd keep body cam angled where it needed to be angled. He said I can't stop people from seeing what they didn't see. And then he added, but I can refuse to hand them the wrong story. He left with brown paper bags full of evidence and a tiredness around the eyes that said he'd be arguing about this in a room without windows. The county scanners bled little bites of update for the rest of the day. Units clearing the trace, a tow called for the ATV, a notation about tranquilizer equipment with stripped labels. By afternoon, a local station put a van at the end of the road, camera pointed at the mailbox like that held the truth. We kept our gate shut and our words smaller than we felt. The news ran with what it had: a poaching ring, unlawful traps, harassment of stock. They showed the little plastic box with its vents and handle and called it a device. They kept their voice even. Nobody said our name. Nobody said the other names that wanted saying. The story held its shape and left just enough unsaid for those who listened for absences. We spent the light driving cedar stakes where the land itself seemed to want them. Along the contour behind the barn, down past the spring where the ground goes soft, across the saddle where elk like to cut the fence and make us forgive them in the morning. Daryl tapped each post deeper than necessary, extra blows for courage more than strength, orange twine strung in a clean line you could follow with your eyes at dusk. I carved signs from thin shakes of cedar, the blade drawing the same image again and again until my hands remembered it without help. 2 circles meeting, the small cradle mark under them, a line that said boundary without saying no, a sign that asked rather than warned. I rubbed resin from the alder into the cut edges with my thumb until the grooves shone. We hung one at the gate, one by the maple, one on the coop that had moved closer to the house like a chick back under a wing. When the wind came off the ridge, the signs made a soft, private click on their nails, like the house clearing its throat to speak politely. By evening, the air had shed the flavor of batteries and fear. The herd moved the way herds move when they're allowed to be animals again. Heads down, tails flicking flies, a slow river of black and red across grass that still held yesterday's tire tracks like faint scars. The dog did a full, extravagant bark at nothing and then caught himself and looked embarrassed. I boiled water just to hear it talk. The kettle made that old rising note and the sound sat right where the bad hum had been, like balm on a burn. We took the ring off the trap hinge, the one left like a coin on the rabbit's paws, and set it on the kitchen sill. Not a trophy, a reminder. The steel was pitted and clean at the same time, age in the rust, fresh honesty in the bright scrape where the jaw had rubbed it. Every time I washed a cup, I touched it without meaning to, and the chill of it ran through me like a story I didn't want to forget. We didn't set bait or leave food out. Instinct said kindness and complication share a fence, and you don't want either one hopping it. I set a low tub of clean water past the maple all the same, not right at the line, just off, where anyone could pretend it was rain if they wanted to. Toward dark, Hale came back, a quick stop in the yard with his headlights off and his dome light on, the way officers make a bubble of privacy out in the open. He said the men were being held. He said nobody had enough bail in their pockets tonight. He said what he could prove and what he could not. He didn't say Bob's name and I didn't ask, and the shape of that silence felt like a door shutting somewhere we couldn't watch. He touched the sign by the gate with the back of 2 fingers, polite, the way you touch a sleeping child's hair, then drove away. The tail lights bled a soft red into the fog and were gone. Full dark came in careful. No rush. The porch bulb threw a small pool over the steps and the rest of the night spread around it like a lake. Somewhere up the hill, an owl opened a question and then closed it again. The radio tower wires sang their glass note and let it die. I sat on the top step with my feet on the next one down and listened to the quiet like it was a person telling me the truth. Daryl sat beside me, one elbow on his knee, the other hand cupped around a mug he wasn't drinking from. We didn't say anything because we'd spent our words on wood and wire and laws, and sometimes quiet is the only thing that pays for what you just asked of a day. 3 knocks came from the timber, even, spaced. They didn't jump me the way they had that first week. They landed like acknowledgement. I felt the boards under me pass the sound along my spine, and the sound settled there without weight. I lifted my knuckles to the porch rail and tapped back 3. The same rhythm I'd used on the barn that rainy night, the same little heartbeat the forest had returned to us. The echo that came was softer, not farther, like a voice lowered to fit a room. I could feel my name in it without hearing it. Not a summons, a greeting. Hello. Across a line we had both chosen to stop making sharp. Fog came up the draw and kept to the ground like milk in a saucer. In it, the yard light made thin ribbons. The first shape showed as a subtraction rather than a body, a taller dark against the lesser dark. Then the edges caught the idea of light and grew a shoulder, a head, a quiet that changed the air. Behind and a half step to the side, a smaller shadow kept pace, not limping so much as guarding a leg it wasn't ready to trust. They stopped where the new stakes began. No toe over, no test. The big one leaned forward once on the balls of its feet the way a parent leans to show a child how not to be afraid. The small one tipped its head. I felt rather than saw the glance from the big one to the sign on the gate. It wasn't checking our work, it was acknowledging it, and something in me eased that I didn't know I'd been clenching since the first morning at the coop. We sat and they stood, and for a very long breath we occupied the same piece of night without trying to own it. My mind reached for names like someone groping for a light switch in a stranger's kitchen. I let that hand fall. 2 circles, overlapping, held. It was enough. Somewhere to the left, a cow dragged her hoof through damp dirt and changed her mind about a drink. The dog lay with his chin on the threshold and did not shake. The knocks came again, same 3, 1 beat longer on the last, and then the sound walked itself back into the trees like a well-behaved guest. In the morning, the papers called it a poaching sting and ran a photo of a trap on a tarp and a box on a tailgate and a deputy making a serious face. They said nothing new because the new part wasn't theirs. Hale's report said what it could say. The rest stayed with the alder and the fence posts and the thin carved signs that clicked softly when the breeze thought to ask them a question. We strung more twine that day, set better braces at the corner near the spring, painted the tops of the stakes with a line of white you could see at dusk from the kitchen window. Not a wall, a seam. The kind that lets 2 pieces move and still hold. That night, the fog came back on small feet and lay sweet over the field. The porch bulb hummed like it had a memory. I stood where the steps give you a view of the stake line and the first rank of firs beyond. The 2 shapes appeared and paused like before. The big one's head turned toward the house, slow, expectant. The small one shifted its weight and set the tender leg down and lifted it again, testing the map of pain. I lifted my hand to the jamb because an old habit wanted a door frame under my palm. The big one made a low sound that wasn't for me and wasn't not for me. A steady note I could feel in my teeth. I didn't speak. I set my knuckles to the rail and tapped 3. The reply came back matched and then folded into the dark. Resin and damp earth and something wild drifted across the yard and faded before it could turn heavy. When they moved, they didn't vanish. They withdrew. The fog didn't swallow them, it accepted their leaving. The last thing I saw was the higher shoulder tilting to make room for the smaller to pass the stump at the edge of the maple's reach. The way you tilt in a crowded hallway to keep from bumping a stranger you care about anyway. The sound of them going was not sound exactly. It was a change in the quiet that settles after presence. Like a bell tone you only realize you've been hearing when it stops. We slept with the windows cracked and the house breathed right. The ring from the trap caught a sliver of moon and threw it onto the sink. Somewhere down in the pasture, water moved over stone and didn't ask permission. I lay awake longer than I needed to and watched the ceiling return the light of the smallest hours. And in that thin, pale hush, I understood my own part better than I had all week. Some borders don't exist to keep the world out. They exist to keep a conversation clean, to give fear a place to stand where it can choose to turn into care, to guard the last fragile inch where trust begins. Near dawn, when the birds made those first ragged stitches into the dark, the knocks came one more time from way back in the timber. Softer, unhurried. I answered without getting up, knuckles tapping the headboard like a child telling a secret to wood. The reply didn't follow, and the quiet that came instead felt like a hand pressed lightly to a shoulder. Enough to say we're here, enough to say we're gone, enough to say the line will hold if we hold it. The day took a breath. So did I. And the house, patient as a witness, kept the sound of last night like a record, so that when the next storm came, or the next stranger, or the next choice, we'd know how to listen before we reached for anything with teeth. Sometimes the lines we draw in life aren't meant to divide, but to protect the fragile balance between worlds. We live in a time where fear often speaks louder than understanding, where the unknown becomes a threat simply because it is different. Yet in the quiet spaces between shadow and light, between the known and the mysterious, there's a place where trust can grow. It begins not with grand gestures, but with the smallest acts of respect, a pause before crossing a boundary, a willingness to listen without needing to own the silence, a recognition that not everything we share this earth with belongs to us to control. The wilderness has its own language, one that cannot be written down in books or captured in photographs. It speaks in the way the wind changes direction before a storm, in the way the forest holds its breath when something sacred passes through. To understand it, we must first admit we are guests here, walking on borrowed ground. And if we are lucky, the land may decide we are worth keeping safe, not because we demand it, but because we've proven we can be trusted with what is precious. Perhaps the greatest truth is that coexistence is not about winning or losing. It's about learning when to step forward and when to stand still, when to speak and when to let the silence carry the meaning for us. The world becomes gentler when we stop trying to shape it entirely in our own image, and instead allow it to teach us how to belong. In those moments, we find that the barriers we once feared are not walls at all, but bridges we haven't learned to walk yet. And maybe that's what life is asking of us. To be careful stewards of the spaces we share, to leave behind signs that say, "I was here and I meant no harm," and to understand that peace isn't something you force, it's something you nurture. In the end, the most enduring connections are not built on ownership or dominance, but on mutual recognition. I see you, you see me. We both choose to let each other be. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the boundaries we cross or the ones we keep, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments, what you believe coexistence truly means, and how we can honor it in our own lives. And if you want to journey deeper into stories like this, filled with mystery, humanity, and the untamed beauty of our world, make sure to follow and subscribe. There's so much more to explore together, and some stories are only just beginning.